Welcome, everyone. Is this on? Yes. Hello. Welcome, everyone. I'm Shelley Hazer. I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning, and I am proud to have this partnership with the St. Augustine Historical Society, the speaker series, and just very thrilled to welcome Dr. Susan Parker here. And Nicole Diem is going to now introduce our speaker, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Susan Richbourg Parker is a researcher, writer, editor, and historical projects consultant. She served as director of researcher for the PBS documentary about colonial St. Augustine, Secrets of Spanish La Florida. And in 2020, she was chosen clerk historian for the St. Johns County Clerk of Courts. She was the executive director of St. Augustine Historical Society and a historian with the Florida Department of State. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Parker.
Thank you all. The introduction of my accomplishments left out that I was runner-up in the county spelling bee in 7th grade. So I actually remember one time I was having to evaluate somebody. She was a teacher who had a lot of, a school teacher who'd had a lot of experience and a lot to say for herself. But the first thing she wrote down was that she was junior homecoming queen in 7th grade, which I thought, well, I guess everybody has their own attitude about what's important, and that's what she wanted to emphasize. Anyway, I'm pleased to see you all this evening. Do we all remember that only a week ago we were wondering how high the winds would get and how much damage we would have? So I think most of us seem to be in pretty good shape here tonight. So I'm glad that you're here. And I think this is an important series that was organized by the St. Augustine Historical Society as we're going in. Can you all hear me in the back? Probably so. It's just a small crowd. As we only have, 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks until voting. And not to be personal about it, but I will be working early voting for 3 days and then at my precinct on election day, which is always very interesting, shall we say. But to that importance of focusing on voting, I want to say that this is partially funded by a grant from the Smithsonian. Is that correct? From the Florida Humanities Council. Okay, if I can remember. And when the Historical Society was putting together the grant application, I suggested that they get a recommendation letter from somebody that they wouldn't usually ask, and that was the St. Johns County Supervisor of Elections, because she's interested in voting. And I know she's very interested in voting over many, many years. And so Vicki Oakes wrote a very nice letter of support for it, not the usual support letters that we get, but I want to quote 2 sentences from her. Access to honest, trusted, election-related education is quite limited, which is why these engagements, meaning these programs, are important. It is incredibly important for residents to learn and understand the history of how these rights came to be. And so that is some of what I'm going to address tonight, and I hope I will use this correctly. Okay. I'm going to speak tonight about a very short period and I'm going to focus a lot on St. Augustine. It says Florida, but let's remember there were not many cities in Florida when Florida was transferred to the United States and became a territory, and certainly St. Augustine was one of the very few. And so I'm going to focus a lot on St. Augustine, but also on the people that lived here and the people that were here when the transfer took place and what that transfer meant for them, as well as voting. I think this is a time period we're not generally real familiar with. We know about the flag being changed at the fort and the soldiers marched in and the soldiers marched out. The transfer itself actually took place at Government House, which was where the documents were signed by both the U.S. and the Spanish officials. But after that, I think for the most part our knowledge kind of fades away and we don't know what happened. And so my question was, I was interested in what happened with voting. And some of this information you all already know here, but I will repeat it anyway, just for those of you that may not. Florida became an American territory in the summer of 1821. when St. Augustine residents and other people living in East Florida as well woke up on the morning of July 10th, 1821, they lived in a Spanish colony. When they went to bed that night, they lived in an American territory. Later on that week, another week later, the transfer that's similar to what happened in St. Augustine would take place in Pensacola, and at that point, the Florida Territory was created. So I will be looking, or we will be looking at those St. Augustinians of 200 years ago as voters. And I had some questions as I started out, and as I guess all good research is, when you start out on a topic that you don't know about, you're always surprised at what you find. Okay, so this is, can I turn this a little so I can see what I'm looking at? This is the Florida that was transferred to the United States. This is colonial Florida. You can see that East and West Florida were two colonies, which you may remember. They were divided at the Apalachicola River. And of course, West Florida went further over all the way to the Mississippi River, and little by little the United States had nibbled away at that territory. But those were the two colonies that were transferred in July of 1821. So what I want to look at is, after this transfer, the questions will be, who can vote? What can they vote for? And I think some of these things are, if you think about it, some of these things are pretty current questions for today. Who can vote? What can they vote for? How are the elections handled in 1821 in a brand new American territory? And included in that is the sentiments of the holdover St. Augustine residents, the people that had been living here that didn't leave, and a lot of them did not leave when Florida became part of the U.S. And they became, I think, marginalized and supplanted by the Americans that were coming in and by American ways. There's a few other things we need to keep in mind that are always running around in the background at this time. Yellow fever is very disruptive. It's hard for for Florida to get organized because of the deaths of the people that are appointed that succumb to yellow fever in both Pensacola and in St. Augustine. And then there's the question of what will become of the Seminoles, because that is a question that has not been resolved either. So that's always in the background. Also keep in mind, as we are here in 2024, that the issue of communications and the speed, or as we might see it, the lack of speed in 1821. We've become very accustomed to instantaneous communication. Even those of us that didn't grow up with instantaneous communication, it's our expectation right now. But it took about 30 days for information to go from Pensacola to St. Augustine. And as a friend of mine once said, how many of you are familiar with the TV show Friends? Okay. If there had been cell phones, they wouldn't have had all their dilemmas because they wouldn't have missed each other and all those problems wouldn't have occurred. And so that's somewhat here. The problems occur while you have that interim between communications coming along. So what I'm going to do is look at the very first two elections, the one in 1822 and 1823. There was a problem with looking at the very first one because the newspapers for 1822 are for the most part missing. They were printed, but they don't seem to be in the archives that are easily accessed. And also the meetings of the Legislative Council, in other words, the legislative body for Florida, for the Florida Territory that year, are also not easily available online, which they are for subsequent years. And not surprisingly, much of what is available is complaints. Bad news brings more information than good news. As a historian, you never want things to go smooth. You want things to be disrupted because there'll be a lot more information for you. Who can vote and what can they vote for? It seems to me that these are some of the most basic and the first questions to be asked in a study of voting. This applied 200 years ago, and I think this applies today as we are preparing to vote, or some of you may have already voted. But let's first look at St. Augustine in 1821, the voters that we're talking about when it was transferred. St. Augustine would become, it already was, but would become a unique city in American Florida because of its age, its established physical and cultural assets, and I think it remains a unique city. I think most of you probably do too. St. Augustine had been a city for 256 years when it was literally with the stroke of a pen made an American city. That's a very long time. But ink does not change sentiments. St. Augustine had been a Spanish city and a capital for 235 years, a British city and capital for 21 years. And in school, we've learned a lot, if we remember it all, from U.S. history, maybe 8th grade history or something like that, about the Northwest Ordinance and how, the U.S. would move towards the West and the establishment of territories. But we learned little about the persons in those territories and how those procedures affected their lives. And so some of that ordinance idea would affect territorial Florida. As I did my work, I found similarities, not surprisingly, between St. Augustine residents in this newly American city and New Orleans residents in a newly American city 20 years earlier. As you may recall, many of the colonists in Louisiana Purchase area in New Orleans, had been Spanish colonists. We think of New Orleans more as being French, but it had been a Spanish colony for 40 years before it was transferred. Just before Napoleon transferred, there had been a secret treaty. No one realized that the French and the Spanish had made this treaty, and it was actually in Napoleon's official ownership, but that was kept under wraps. And just before what I'm saying is New Orleans had been a Spanish city for 40 years before it was transferred. Even though there were a lot of French people there, it had been a Spanish city. In territories, presidents, the U.S. presidents had an enormous authority on the handling of what happened in the territories. And with the New Orleans territory, Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, acted almost like an emperor rather than a president. He found the New Orleanian residents to be unable to govern themselves, too ignorant to elect a legislature, and in his words, as incapable of self-government as children. Yet, Spanish New Orleans had a city government. They had a city hall building, which, if you've been to New Orleans, is right on the edge of Jackson Square today. It was then, as a matter of fact. And I think that's a substantial physical evidence of the fact that they had been governing themselves. This was not some small makeshift building. Jefferson's public comments about New Orleanians may have somewhat been a smokescreen. Perhaps he didn't feel quite as strongly about them as he said, to justify their inability to vote, for he feared how their voting might upset the balance in Congress. Gee. Wait a minute, are we watching the news? Louisiana geographer Richard Campanella's description of New Orleanians in 1803, at the time of the transfer to the U.S., probably well describes Spanish Floridians in St. Augustine 2 decades later. Campanella wrote, compared to their new compatriots, they spoke a different language, practiced a different religion, and followed distinct legal philosophies. They perceived race and managed slavery differently. They ate different foods, celebrated different festivals, and honored different heroes. And while almost 20 years had passed since the transfer of Louisiana to the U.S., many of those attitudes continued about Louisiana and would wash over onto St. Augustine as well. The preconceived ideas or prejudices of the incoming Americans notwithstanding, we know this, St. Augustine was no frontier in 1821 in the sense of being undeveloped. It had a well-established culture, a well-established physical organization. Let's remember, the oldest part of the city's layout dates from the 1570s, long before this period. Its central gathering place, the plaza, the seat of government, were well more than 2 centuries old at the time of the transfer. Certainly its cultural and social life, especially with the strong role of the Roman Catholic Church, both as a structure on the plaza and as an institution, had created what I would say a rather orderly view of life. And since St. Augustine had been a military, Florida and St. Augustine had been a military colony mostly for a long time, and its main employer was the military, certainly life was ordered and hierarchical in a military colony. The stolid, I think it's stolid, and solid Castillo de San Marcos presented a symbol of protection, and St. Augustinians were well aware that it actually offered protection in the past. It was 150 years old at the time of the transfer. St. Augustine had been a city before any of the places that were the sources or origin of the newcomers coming into Florida had existed. Before 1600 in St. Augustine, there was a church, hospital, regular celebrations, and an orderly of transfer of power at the top, or usually. Most of the disruptions or setbacks to St. Augustine's life and development were actually from threats by the English or British, and later from the United States. In fact, less than 10 years before the transfer to the United States, East Florida had been invaded by American troops, and the countryside had been badly damaged. St. Augustine, they went around St. Augustine. St. Augustine was not damaged, mostly because they were afraid of the guns of the fort, and they did not have the information as to how inoperable the guns of the fort were. But, it worked. St. Augustine had been surrounded by American troops, as I said, but did not surrender. And it was really about the only part of Spanish East Florida that remained intact. There had been another invasion in 1795, and there were still animosities among the residents in St. Augustine and some of the people that lived out on the St. Johns River, on the St. Mary's, out in the countryside about all this. Spanish St. Augustine had an elected city council where, Jefferson is saying these people don't know how to govern themselves. Well, they had an elected city council. These are the minutes of the city council. And you can see on the left-hand side, all of the city councilmen signed the minutes. They didn't just approve them by voice vote, they signed the minutes. St. Augustine wasn't the only city in East Florida. Fernandina had also been created as a city, although it was much, much younger than St. Augustine. And Spanish Floridians at the time of the transfer to the United States were in the process of choosing by election a representative to go to the Cortes, or the parliament in Spain. So they had participated in election politics. In other words, the idea that these new territorial people couldn't handle elections was a fiction, as far as I see it. Now, obviously, if you look at all this, St. Augustinians had really very little reasons to want a change of government. It was those persons waiting on the other side of the Florida border, or who had already jumped the border, as the term was at the time, that wanted the change of flags. And unfortunately, they expect St. Augustinians to get over their ideas very quickly. Perhaps the St. Augustinians would have done so if there had been a reason. As I said at the time of the transfer, the city St. Augustine, Fernandina, and of course Pensacola in West Florida. But the most rapidly growing area of the new Florida territory was the area that was growing short staple or short fiber cotton around Tallahassee and Quincy. That was where most of the land was available. Long staple or long fiber cotton was grown in East Florida, also known as Sea Island cotton. We might call it Pima cotton. It goes by a number of different names. They're cotton, but they're really quite different from each other. Sea Island cotton required more growing days. It was already being grown in Northeast Florida during the Spanish period, and much of the land to grow it was in private ownership. And actually, because I worked on some plantation stuff, some of these Sea Island cotton plantations, they were even sold in different, because there was a lot of this was sold in the markets in England. And they were sold in two entirely different markets because they were used for two different things. Short staple cotton is very durable. Long staple cotton had a very lustrous fiber and was used for fine laces and things like that. And so the price of one might be up while the price of the other was down. Even though it was cotton growing, it was different. President James Monroe had appointed Andrew Jackson to be governor of the territory of Florida. Now, in truth, Jackson spent very little time in American Florida. He was here before the transfer, but after it became American, he was here for maybe 6 or 7 weeks. He never came to St. Augustine. Of course, he didn't come to Jacksonville because Jacksonville didn't exist. That's just the truth. Monroe appointed William Worthington to be acting governor of East Florida. Florida was so big and spread out that they kept the two old capitals of St. Augustine and Pensacola. And William Worthington, who had just spent about 3 or 4 years being a diplomat in South America, was appointed to be the governor here, or the acting governor or associate governor. He arrived in St. Augustine about 5 weeks after the transfer. And Jackson would leave the Florida Territory about 2 weeks after that. He left the Florida Territory in early September. He would go back to his home and then send his resignation in, which was, I think, dated for early December when the Congress convened. Jackson went back because his wife was sick. So people resigning their political offices because they have sick families is not new. Whether that's just a good ruse or whether it's true, or a little of both. But nevertheless, during his short tenure, Andrew Jackson had made plans for the organization of the new territory, and he did a good job of it. He immediately published a number of ordinances, and with regard to citizenship and thus to voting. Jackson's ordinances invoked the Treaty of Transfer between Spain and the United States, which you probably know as the Adams-Onis Treaty. And Section 6, which stated that upon entrance into the Union, the inhabitants thereof, meaning of Florida, shall be admitted to the enjoyment of all rights, privileges, and immunities of the citizens of the United States. He quoted this language exactly in his ordinance number 3 and affirmed that those persons in the territory on July 17, the date of the transfer in Pensacola, were now U.S. citizens, as if born in the United States. There was no naturalization ceremony. They were just automatically citizens of the U.S. if they were here as residents at the date of the transfer. It's interesting because the late historian John Mahan commented that, and this caused some problems for a while, a literal interpretation of the treaty meant that the Negroes and the Indians, as well as white men, would be admitted to these privileges if you took the treaty exactly. And it might surprise you to know, because it did me, that a Committee on Indian Affairs of the U.S. House of Representatives was established to consider this issue and took this treaty agreement, the Adams-Onis Treaty, very seriously. The committee recommended that the Native Americans must be accorded privileges of citizens of the United States. And they also recommended a plan that would amalgamate Indians into white society. We all know that is not what happened at this point, and I'm not going to get into that issue because that's definitely a digression. But it's interesting that they thought that maybe the Indians should be citizens as well as the others because they were resident in the territory at the time. Governor Jackson ordered that mayors and other officials would maintain a list of every free male member of a family who became citizens at the time of the transfer. He required that citizens would abjure, in other words, deny, all foreign allegiance and take an oath of allegiance to the United States. New American citizens, they may not have been new residents, but new American citizens, could acquire a certificate for $1 that said they were a citizen. Now, that is a huge amount of money in 1821. And not only is it a lot of money in 1821, it was just hard for people to get cash. They didn't deal with a lot of cash. Most of the businessmen might, but most people didn't have a lot of cash. They grew their own. They a lot more self-sufficient. They didn't have that cash. So one of the questions is, which they didn't ask at the time, but I will, where does this leave the females? Anyway, Jackson's ordinances address the existence and orderliness of life in St. Augustine and the community's health, especially with the concern for yellow fever. And there was concern for yellow fever everywhere along the Atlantic coast, not just in St. Augustine. Jackson ordered that from June 1 until November 1, any ships that came into port in St. Augustine and other parts in Florida that had come into port anywhere between the equator and 35 degrees north latitude, which is about where New Bern, North Carolina is, had to quarantine outside the city. So almost all the ships coming in had to quarantine first, and a health officer would go out to inspect the crew. Let's remember, at this time, ships moving around were probably one of the biggest sources of yellow fever being spread, and we did not know how yellow fever was spread. There were all sorts of theories, but certainly the idea that it was spread by mosquitoes, as you probably remember, would take a number of years still to come to fruition. So he established 2 counties for the new territory, St. John's and Escambia, divided by the Suwannee River. Now, as you looked at this map earlier, he shifted the border for East Florida and West Florida. It had been at the Apalachicola River, when West Florida was much bigger. Now he moved it to the Swanee. Okay. And a month after signing the ordinances, they were published in St. Augustine. So it wasn't too long before the people here were aware of them. Now, we might reasonably assume that among the rights and privileges that are invoked in the treaty and in Jackson's ordinances was the right to vote. Now, that would be the right to vote for free males. But there was little to vote for. The governor or the U.S. president appointed almost all public officials. There was very little for the citizens to choose under the territorial situation. Now, Governor Jackson decided that the councilmen elected under the Spanish years in St. Augustine would continue in their positions. They now served at Jackson's pleasure and thus were technically his appointees, you might say. But they didn't like the idea. 4 or 5 of them immediately resigned instead of taking the oath of allegiance to the U.S., leaving the new Governor Worthington to appoint the rest of the city council, which he did. He appointed four new city councilmen. After the new mayor was chosen, he had a reception at his home, which was attended by the residents of St. Augustine. I don't know if all of them or just maybe the voting residents. And there were even some Indians that attended who were camped around the town. And he provided refreshment. Different refreshment for the residents of St. Augustine than for the Indians. And that's what the newspaper reported. There was some sort. It's always a delicious refreshment. It doesn't tell you what it is. I mean, that's about all you know. Probably something alcoholic, and there was some sort of grain for the Indians. So it was, it's a little tiny piece. That's about all I can tell you. So if we're going to talk about voting, let's stop a minute to look at the voting population of St. Augustine. And let me start by saying, still today, but even more so then, dealing with numbers and coming up with decent numbers is very, very difficult. You have partial reports. You have reports that don't match with each other. It's as a historian, I can tell you, numbers hardly ever gel. I can tell you that almost all the battles that I have earlier than this, battles that I've read reports about, both sides were outnumbered. If you lose, it's because you were outnumbered. If you win, it's because you had a superior force. So it's, like I said, it's very, numbers are interesting, but you have to be extremely, don't take them to heart, shall we say. Okay, so let me see. I can't see what I've got here, okay. Okay, the first census was taken in Florida in 1830 because the U.S. takes a census every 10 years because Florida was transferred in 1821. Of course, it had just missed the 1820 census. There's no 1820 census. That's one of the reasons there's no even sort of good numbers. By 1830, this was the map of Florida. A number of new counties had been established. You can see it was inevitable. St. Johns County was going to become smaller and smaller when it was the entire peninsular part of the estate. I did have a woman call me one time. She was worried about the conspiracy to make St. Johns County ever smaller that had been going on for a long time. And I said, well, yeah, that's true. But, if your county seat's in St. Augustine and you're down in Key West and you've got business, that's not very workable, even today with our communications and travel. So, we get these numbers. I think, for me, numbers are easier to look at than to listen to. The 1830 census counted, as you can see here, I think, 2,550 persons in St. Johns County. It was a smaller county than it had been when it became Florida, and at the first time of voting. Of the total population, and these are some of my own just based on the numbers, about 53% were white, 47% were black, 59% were free, and 41% were enslaved. And so we have, I think I put it on here, I have the number of white, the free blacks. There were still a number of free blacks in St. Augustine. And how I've done the numbers is that for the most part at this time, because they don't really give me the numbers in this way, most of the population was half female, half male. And so I've just used 50-50. It could go one way, but still it was mostly that way. Approximately, but we have to remember now how many of these people can vote. approximately 670 people were white, and half of that for males who were eligible to vote left about 335. I think that's the number I have up there. Remember, only free men could vote. At this time, free blacks could vote. They will, over the years, find that become more and more restricted. And thus, in the end, about 30% of the adult population of St. Johns County was eligible to vote. Women could not vote. Native Americans could not vote. In a sense, that was moot because the Indians weren't included in the census, so their numbers aren't here anyway. And according to historian Edward Baptist, who has done a lot of study of people in the Tallahassee area, he said that the elite planters in that area preferred that the Midland whites not vote either. Well, they wanted to control the politics. If you were eligible to vote out of all of this, just what positions could you choose? As I said, most government posts in the territory were appointed, and many of them were federal posts. So people in the territory. The U.S. president often paid back political debts with appointments, or used Florida as what I call an advance penance for going to a better position. So if you'll go to Florida for a while, I'll give you a better position. There was a lot of thought that was one of the dissatisfactions and reasons that Andrew Jackson left so quickly. He thought he would be able to appoint a lot more people than he was, but President Monroe did most of the appointments. Residents did not choose the persons who passed the laws for the territory they lived in. They were done mostly by appointees. The laws on taxes, the operation of courts, and even the regulation of animals. And I do have to take just an aside here for a minute. As we read it from a 21st century wording and stuff, one of the early laws that was passed by the Florida Legislative Council was an act to control the running wild of horses and asses. Well, I mean, I did have to laugh at it. I know what they meant, but it was just, anyway, the laws were made at the meeting of the appointed Legislative Council. The appointees were made by the U.S. President. Now, Monroe said, well, how many people do I appoint? I don't know where he got his numbers. There was no census to base it on, but Monroe based his appointment on the idea that there were 13,000 people in the entire Florida territory. And so he would appoint a council member for each 1,000 people. And he estimated that East Florida had 8,000 and that West Florida had 5,000. These appointees were made by the president, and then they had to be approved by the Congress. Many times these appointees didn't even live in Florida when he made the appointment, although they were coming into Florida to make laws for Florida. Once again, it's the political payback. It's the people that you want in there making laws. A lot of them refused the appointment. It was too expensive sometimes to take time off from their business if they didn't think that being part of the legislature would be beneficial. They had to pay their own travel. They had to pay their own lodging. And so he had a lot of people that would back out. And I don't think they ever had a full legislative council in attendance. The first legislative council that ever met in Florida met in Pensacola, which you all may remember. And as I said, it's unfortunate that the newspaper for that year has not survived, although there are some letters and writings about it. Citizens were eager at the time, even clamoring for the council to establish county courts. A lot of them they had bills that were due them, and the only way they could collect them was going through the courts. And they wanted them to pass laws to maintain peace and protect private property, especially livestock. We also know that the 1822 council passed a very unpopular, taxation law. I don't know when taxation laws have ever been popular, but this one was unpopular. The issue is that really the territory had no money to run the territory at all. I mean, the federal government did their things, but as far as the running of the territory itself, there was no source of income. And so I don't know how, if the residents had thought about it, they thought you were going to run a territorial government if you didn't pay taxes. If there were problems with elections, and we've heard a lot about this recently, these were addressed to the highest officers in the United States, the president, and more often they addressed them to the Secretary of State. Today we think of the Secretary of State as someone who mostly deals in diplomacy and foreign relations, but at this time they addressed them to the Secretary of State. This procedure reflected the wishes of the executive branch of the government at that time to directly oversee the territory activities. And no doubt, perhaps from the perspective of the voters, reflected their inferior or undeveloped citizenship. They had little opportunity to engage the rights that supposedly U.S. citizenship offered them in St. Augustine. Unhappy voters in Florida Territory had no other recourse than to appeal to the highest levels of the government, for there was no intervening level to go to. And there was really only one office in 1822 that voters could vote on: the delegate to represent them in Congress. The territorial delegate, as today, although there have been changes, the territorial delegate was an advocate for the territory. He could lobby, he could talk, he could try to, make deals, but he could not vote. And one of the biggest problems with territory-wide voting for this one territorial delegate is that, as I said, it would take more than a month from the first day of voting for all the votes to be counted, given the distance between St. Augustine and Pensacola. And of course, there was rivalry between West Florida and East Florida, and I'm not sure that there still isn't. And I think it's understandable. Everybody would expect a delegate would favor their home area more than perhaps a place that's 300 or 400 miles away, whichever direction it is. But there were a number of problems, apparently, with the 1822 election. And there is an anonymous writer in East Florida who complains to Secretary of State John Quincy Adams about the election irregularities. Okay. The governor at this time by now is Governor Duval. Governor set up the election so that a man named Dr. Bruno would win. Dr. Bruno was the president of the Legislative Council. He was in Pensacola, so they thought he manipulated the election to get him to win. The governor attempted to add votes for Dr. Bruno by having the soldiers who were not Florida citizens but were stationed in Florida to vote in the Florida election. The Legislative Council, which was convening in Pensacola, already late, largely because of travel problems and other things, didn't immediately address the issue of having a territorial delegate elected, but waited 3 weeks to ever talk about it, when it was one of the first most important items they had. And that's some of it because the delegate had to be elected, he had to get to Washington in time. This is communications and travel issues as well. That Governor Duval made it more convenient for voters, those 5,000 voters, remember how the president counted them? Those 5,000 voters in West Florida to vote than it was for voters in East Florida, because he set up 6 voting places in West Florida, but only 3 in East Florida, which had a larger population. The governor wanted viva voce voting. In other words, he wanted people to say out loud who they were voting for. You can imagine how people objected to that. Well, I'm sure a number of them were worried about the repercussions if it was known who they voted for. Make sure I'm on the same here. The election personnel, called election judges at that time, they were all called judges, who worked at the voting site, I don't think it was a precinct at the time, at Calford, which of course is at the Main Street Bridge in downtown Jacksonville now, purposefully stayed away from the voting location so that there wouldn't be enough people there so that the ballots would be valid. So the ballots from that area would be invalidated. The sheriff of Duval County and of St. Johns County showed up at polling places and threatened to reveal who had not voted for the governor's favored person, and they bribed with liquor. So there were quite a number of irregularities or complaints in the very first election in Florida. Of course, the interesting thing is, as I said, they said that Governor Duval tried to throw the election or get the election for Bruno. But in the end, Bruno didn't win at all. He died of yellow fever. He died during the meeting of the Legislative Council in Pensacola. He was president, and he died while the council was going on. Still, part of these accusations, Sheriff Dell of Duval County encouraged persons to vote for Bruno even after they knew that Bruno was dead. Now, this is the reverse of dead people voting, isn't it? But because the council was still in session, it could immediately act on the issue of a territorial delegate. And so they chose Joseph Hernandez of East Florida. Of course, Bruno was one of those people that had only come into Florida really. Hernandez was definitely a Floridian. And so one of the few elected officials of territorial Florida, one of the only, in fact, at this time, elected officials of territorial, ended up being appointed because of the death, and appointed by the people who were appointed by the president. So there was really no electoral selections here at all. I want to move on to the next election in 1823, which will be for the territorial delegate. Okay, in the spring of 1823, it seemed like everything that was going on all came together. You know, it's kind of like a glass where you pour in milk, and then you pour in water, and then you pour in liquor, and then you pour in lemonade, and it overflows. It's not one item, but it's a whole lot of things. A lot of the issues that were bothering Floridians seemed to converge all at the same time. And they also faced how much the appointees controlled the democratic politics of life of the new territory. So here's what was going on at the time. They were voting for a territorial delegate. The Territorial Legislative Council, the legislature, would be meeting in St. Augustine this time at Government House. The idea was to go back and forth. As you know, that didn't happen. At the meeting in St. Augustine, they decided to choose the area around Tallahassee, which became Tallahassee, as the capital, and then the next year they would meet there. The Land Claims Commission was preparing to meet in St. Augustine. This is the commission that will validate people's land ownership held over from Spanish times. That's been in flux here as to who owns property. And although people expected to deal with that for their lots out in the countryside, then the people in St. Augustine and Fernandina found out that their town lots would also have to be adjudicated as well. And they were really upset about that. And as I mentioned before, throughout all this issue, the issue of Seminole lands remained unaddressed, and thus there was no resolution. All of this added up to unsettledness, and a political contest added yet another element of uncertainty for the locals. The Land Claims Commission began meeting in August in Government House, but the notices were in the newspaper for a while before that. You know, bring in, and in English and Spanish, bring in your documents. The old residents had expected to deal with the verification of their land, as I said, in the countryside. But property owners in the city in St. Augustine and Fernandina became disgruntled when they learned that they would have to submit their lot claims to the scrutiny of the Land Commission. For they held that the treaty, back to the Adams-Onis Treaty, implied that the lots were accepted. With all this going on, Governor Duval arrived in St. Augustine to prepare for the meeting of the Legislative Council. The voting for the territorial delegate would take place in Government House while the Legislative Council was meeting in Government House. And here we do know who attended the list of the legislative, but because of the communications, the travel, the list of appointees keeps changing because the president appoints people, as I said, and then they say, I can't do it. I'm resigning. But remember how long all this information takes to go back and forth? Because to go to the president has to go to Washington. So he sends, now some of the people were in South Carolina that he appointed. They were residents of South Carolina. And so he said, well, maybe I'll go to Florida and be part of the Legislative Council there. And so that roster keeps changing. Interesting, as I said, the appointees had to bear their own expenses, their own travel. And then there's always a few things that don't change. The Legislative Council, the legislators, argued over what time to begin their sessions. Should they start at 9 o'clock or should they start at 10 o'clock? They finally decided they liked the later hour and moved on to debate about whether or not to charge 50 cents to legislators that were late to the meeting. In the end, they decided not to penalize themselves, which I don't find too surprising. But in spring of 1823, we see the declaration of 4 persons running to be territorial delegate. The candidates were the sitting or incumbent territorial delegate, Joseph Hernandez, Richard Call, Alexander Hamilton Jr., and Farquhar Bethune. And Alexander Hamilton Jr., so there's no confusion, is the son of Alexander Hamilton of the $10 bill and other fame. Hamilton and Hernandez, interestingly enough, although they would be running against each other, had both sailed back from Charleston on the same ship, the Rapid, to get off at St. Augustine. And the day after that, Hernandez's candidacy appeared in the local newspaper. And the day after that, and on that same day, Hamilton's candidacy appeared in the newspaper, and the proponents for Hernandez had a meeting. Now, the newspaper owner he didn't particularly care for the holdover St. Augustinians, and I could do a whole talk on the things he said about them. But he praised Hamilton's knowledge of U.S. law and politics and his connections, which probably he had. The newspaper's editor said that he hoped that Hernandez would not run again and leave the field open to Hamilton, somebody who had been here 10 months. Hamilton's supporters, he said, will never resort to the measure which degraded the former election and elective franchise. They will be courteous, mild, and gentlemanly. Right after Hernandez got back in town, 40 citizens and gentlemen from other parts of the territory convened at a public meeting and, of course, nominated Hernandez to be one of the candidates. And they said, too, that they would promote his election by all fair and honorable means. Now, unfortunately, the newspaper doesn't talk at all about any of the election stuff. There's very little about it. 3 of the candidates were residents of East Florida. Joseph Hernandez and Farquhar Bethune had lived in Spanish East Florida for years. Hernandez was born in Spanish St. Augustine in 1788, and thus, as you may know, was the first Hispanic person to serve in Congress because he was born in Spanish land. Hernandez lived in St. Augustine and at his Sea Island cotton plantation, which is down in the area of Bing's Landing south of Washington Oaks Park. Farquhar Bethune had been a resident of Spanish East Florida at least for 20 years, maybe longer. I don't have that information, before Spain was transferred to the U.S. He had been a planter on the Halifax River and had asked for a land grant down there, and then he moved to Amelia Island. He had fought the invaders, the American troops invading in 1812 and 1813, and perhaps his loyalty to the Spanish at that time, when most of his neighbors were actually supporting the American troops, was a negative in his campaign. Bethune was probably the least well-known, or at least to us, among the candidates. Alexander Hamilton Jr. is certainly a familiar name. He came to East Florida in 1822, the year before, because he had been appointed U.S. District Attorney by the President, U.S. District Attorney for Florida. And then he was appointed to the Land Commission, which would review the land claims. Richard K. Call had recently moved to Pensacola, and he had put a 4-line announcement in the same newspaper in St. Augustine that he was running for office. Call was heavily associated with Andrew Jackson. He had joined a volunteer unit under Jackson in 1813. He fought at the Battle of New Orleans, and he negotiated with the Spanish West Florida Governor Callava, about the change of flags. So Call was a newcomer to Florida. Those are the 4 candidates. What about the qualifications for the people that can vote? The East Florida Herald, the newspaper, published just before voting started the qualifications. A residence in the territory on the 17th day of July, 1821, the day the transfer took place, which we've already talked about, or a year later on the 12th day of August in 1822, the day that the legislature passed the election law. So there was a year in between when people could move in and become residents. Voting in St. Augustine took place at the old government house. It began on Monday, June 2nd, after a blessed 4-week election campaign season. Can you imagine only a 4-week election campaign? That'd be great, wouldn't it? Although we know nothing about it, unfortunately, or very little about it. Anyway, it began on Monday, June 2nd at 8 o'clock until 6 p.m., and they would vote for 3 days in a row, not just one day. While the men were voting in Government House, as I mentioned, the Legislative Council was meeting in the building. Candidate Richard Call was up in the legislative session, submitting bills and voting on territorial laws. And while we have very few complaints about this election, we do have one, which is kind of interesting, and that is a man who takes an ad out in the newspaper a Mr. Edwards, one of the judges, remember these are election officials, of the delegate election in Jacksonville, posted an ad in the East Florida Herald to deny that he had threatened to harm anyone who attempted to cross the St. Johns River, which was the county line at that time, as you can see, with the intention to vote for General Hernandez. So he took an ad out about it. Hernandez carried the city of St. Augustine. Not surprising, he had been here a long time. He got 212 votes. Hamilton got 42. Call got 6. The newspaper editor, a Hamilton supporter, by the way, remember, attributed the numbers not to the merits of the candidates, but to national prejudices. And thus the editor, I think, somewhat continued the position that the holdover residents were not really Americans. They were still focusing on the others. Little by little, the election returns dribbled in. They came from Fernandina. They came from Mosquito, which is the area around Ponce Inlet. It used to be called Mosquito Inlet, well named, and then became Ponce de Leon Inlet. Bethune received all but one vote cast in Fernandina, and the election, in fact, illustrated the lack of unity between East and West Florida. They had been separate entities, let's remember, for 60 years when the British Board of Trade had separated them at that time. So they had been separate entities for a long time. Let me see if I have this one here. And these are the results in East Florida, not just St. Augustine. So you can see very close between Hernandez and, it's within the margin of error. They would have to do a recount. Bethune 6 and Call 9. Call came in a distant place in the election in East Florida, and while he made an extremely poor showing in East Florida, he took all but one vote in West Florida and won the election. So they really got their workers out in West Florida to make him the territorial delegate. Okay, so but in the midst of all of this, while the election's kind of up in the air, they don't have all it. The residents are still fretting about their land titles, and this is all gets wrapped into the election, and about the reprisals that Alexander Hamilton has threatened if he finds out that they voted against him. Now they're really glad they didn't have voice voting, aren't they? Yeah. And they became concerned about the Catholic Church property. The residents petitioned President Monroe to rescind his appointment of Alexander Hamilton as a land commissioner. They feared reprisals for anyone whom Hamilton learned had not voted for him for delegate. He did not win the race, but he still could wield power in his Land Claims Commission. Their petition, which went to the president, said, Alexander Hamilton does not possess those good qualities which ought to adorn a public officer. I love the language at this time. The residents claimed that Hamilton had reminded them that he had in his hands the power to decide the fates of nearly all of their land titles, and in deciding the validity of the titles, he had threatened to feel resentment toward any of those who he had learned had not voted for him, and this is included in the petition that they send to the president. Not only had Hamilton threatened the validity of the residents' land titles, but he threatened the ownership of the Catholic parish church. He set forth an opinion that property of the Roman Catholic Church under Spanish law was property of the Spanish crown, and therefore government property. With the cession of Florida to the United States, Spanish crown property, government property, passed to United States ownership, and thus the church was under government ownership. In a sense, there was a precedent for this sovereign government-to-government transfer, as Great Britain had done this when they took over Florida 60 years before, and they declared that the Franciscan convent, which of course is today's National Guard headquarters, was government property. It was part of the Spanish crown, and they took it to be government property and turned it into a military barrack. And of course, it has been a military property since the 1760s. How that would have settled, we don't know, but remember, when the British were here, there were hardly any Spanish left, and so there was really no one to say this is right, this is wrong, or not. Now, Hamilton might have been more concerned about land ownership of the church than with the movable property, in other words, the things inside the church of the local parish, chalices, bells, processional crosses, altar hangings, and statues. But the parish members saw Hamilton's claiming government ownership of the church as possibly also affecting the ownership of those items as well. They were very, very upset about it. In the end, Hamilton resigned as land commissioner, not until March 31 of 1824. But he would be available in Charleston if needed. Alexander Hamilton's time in St. Augustine was one of contentious litigation. Hamilton filed 2 suits as he left for libel, mostly related that he had been libeled, yes, because it was printed, related to the remarks that had been sent to the president. And these first 2 elections were thus over. So let's go back to our first question that I asked you. Who can vote? Free males. These are only 2 elections. Things will change as time goes because things always change with time. For talk in 2024, not to mention and almost ignore 3/4 of the population in the town, the women and the slaves, seems almost like I live on another planet. But if we are talking about voting in Florida's earliest American years, the focus is on free males. And only a few of those were black, but they could vote too. Who could they vote for? The territorial delegate, the one thing they could vote for. A non-voting advocate in Congress. They could not vote for the Legislative Council. And I'm not saying this is just Florida, but we're talking about St. Augustine in Florida right now. Who made the laws for the territories and who passed the bills regarding taxes. One of the big cries is, no taxation without representation. Well, they had representation, but it wasn't elected representation. And then the question is, these early council members, how much of a stake did they have in Florida? How much of a stake did most of these people have in Florida? Governor Duval spent 6 months of his, at least in his early appointment, 6 months of his time on his plantation in Kentucky. He was only in Florida 6 months of the time to oversee what was going on. He had other things to do, even though he was governor. These weren't seen as full-time jobs, for one thing. How were the elections handled? Well, we found out a little about what we found out was how they went wrong, or how people said they went wrong. As I said, there was only a month between the official nomination and the election. The polls were open for 3 days with 3 judges, and the judges were each paid $7 a day, which was probably a good bit of money at that time. A question that I did not ask, but that the voting illustrated, I think, was the lack of unity between East and West Florida. And it's interesting, at this time, East Floridians, I can't remember if they sent a petition to the president or not, but they at least put it in writing. They thought West Florida ought to be joined to Alabama. And then East Florida would be its own territory. And they put it in the context of well, you'll save a lot of money if you make West Florida part of Alabama, which is already an existing state. You won't have to send federal money to support West Florida. We know that didn't happen, but it's interesting. And we'll see this unity, or this lack of unity, will continue. As Florida moved, took a long time for Florida to become a state, but as Florida moved towards statehood, there was talk about Florida becoming 2 states, East Florida and West Florida. There was even a move to make a 3rd state with Middle Florida so that it would come in as 3 different states. Statehood was not really popular in East Florida. It was much more popular in West Florida, or what we might call Middle Florida. I don't know what its name would have been. It had been a state. So that's how the first elections went in St. Augustine, and we'll see how the elections go in 3 weeks in St. Augustine. Thank you. I think it was 21. I think so. I think it was adulthood. And of course, you had to register with the mayor, or you had to register somewhere. So I think it was 21. I'm sure I could find it, but I don't recall. But I think it was 21. The idea of 18-year-old adulthood is something that is actually fairly recent, at least in the United States. Tom? No, I don't know. It's not in the news. It's not in the newspapers. We certainly don't have the election. All we have is the raw numbers, and almost all almost all this information comes out of the newspapers. Whatever happened to the original. I mean, what did the election slips? I assume they were slips of paper. What did they look like? What did the blocks look like? How did they secure? Well, maybe they had some issues, but how did they secure the votes after somebody voted? So I don't know how many. I don't think that some of the free blacks in St. Augustine voted. I don't know, but that's just a guess.
Alexander Hamilton Jr. was appointed by President Monroe.
Right.
Okay. And his name has appeared on as part of property ownership. So as the land commissioner, did he actually take title to properties as the land commissioner?
He bought property while he was here. I do not know, I don't recall, I've seen it certainly in the deeds. And often he's saying at that point, just here's Alexander Hamilton, so we're talking about, obviously, a lot of times people drop the junior after their father has passed. Of course, his father had passed, or had been killed actually in the duel, before Alexander Hamilton was made. So I don't know that those land titles had been affirmed by the time he bought them, but if they were affirmed after the fact, that it's still belonging. Speculated down in the area along the seawall, just across from Avenida Menendez, across from O.C. Weiss and Eddy, about a number of properties in that area. And it's interesting because they describe the property and they say on several, there's different sized pieces of property left from the Spanish period, none of them the same size. They're certainly not like the subdivision that's laid out. And they say the lot on which the chimney is still standing from the 1811 hurricane. So the coquina chimneys stood, but they had wooden houses around it for the most part. So the houses had either collapsed in the hurricane. It came out of the hurricane. It was really, really bad in St. Augustine. And but they mentioned that the coquina chimneys were still standing. That's kind of interesting.
Do you know if being able to read was a requirement to vote?
Who?
Being able to read was a requirement?
I don't know. I don't know how they dealt with people that there would be an awful lot of people that probably couldn't read.
I was just wondering if that's part of the reason why they wanted the voice vote on top of it.
I don't know. My guess is the voice vote was more that they wanted to vote. Who? Of course, now we have because I actually work with polls. There's if you've ever had anybody there who has a problem with voting, there's a number of papers to fill out if you're going to read it to somebody, or if it's in language, if it's not English or Spanish, if someone has to translate it for them. So any of those sorts of things, they don't read themselves or have a problem reading. So we have a lot of processes in place now for someone who can't read for whatever reason to vote. At that time, I don't know, and who knows? I mean, you imagine being at where the Main Street Bridge is, Calford. There's probably a few houses, or a few buildings in 1822, a trade store or something. Not being dismissive. You're pretty isolated. I'll write down Hamilton for you because you don't know how to read Hamilton anyway. And I'm not saying that.
That was what I was.
Yeah. So I don't know what sort of protection I might say they had in place for that. And that would be certainly there's plenty of people still at this time signing deeds with X's. There was a process then, as there still is, for extra witnesses and testifies. If someone signs with an X, there's extra language that goes along with it. But I don't know about the voting. It's probably maybe in St. Augustine. St. Augustine's, there's a lot of people that know each other. It's pretty solidly populated. But at Mosquito, or Calford, or Fernandina was a town that was a small town. My question answers, I don't know. That's a good question.
I have two things. One, just the buffoon name. would that be related to the food movement?
I don't know. I don't know.
And the-
I wondered about that too, but I haven't.
And the thing when you mentioned about the women, of course, we know that some states before 1920 allowed women to vote. But when you mentioned about the women, I do know from my own ancestry research that that I learned that if a man naturalized or was considered a citizen, his wife was back at a certain date. That his status conferred on her.
But she wasn't. I guess she didn't. But she didn't get registered.
I
don't know.
And I'm not talking about the voting.
I wondered what happened with widows.
Yeah.
With some people that were widows,
Right.
widows at the time.
I have no idea about the
Yeah.
voting. I just know the citizenship. When I did a little research paper when the census was coming out, they were talking about whether to ask people where they came from or their parents and so forth. I wrote a little paper about it because when you're doing ancestry research, oh my gosh, it's so fascinating, the census records and whether people had radios and how many children that lived.
1922.
God, it's so amazing.
You know, the other thing is that the lists, where they want the list of people, it's not just for voting. They want to know who's eligible for the militia. So they will use the registration list for who will be eligible for the militia as well. Because the militia was around, but let's remember that at this time, there was a lot of concern. I didn't even talk about the Seminoles at all, which all of this is going on. And not too long after that 1823 election, of course, the Treaty of Moultrie Creek is signed in September, so the election is finally reported in early August, and then the first treaty with the Seminoles is signed a month later. So those lists, like today, they serve a lot of different purposes. Well, thank you all so much.